for this opportunity of having these dialogues. Clearly, we are all having different perches from where we're watching the picture of what we think constitutes Indian farming as well as agriculture. And we have our own small frames that we are carrying away as our imagination of what agriculture is about and what needs to be done about this. I'm not too sure whether the full picture would have fallen into place after these 2 days either, though you've done your best to, bring people who are looking mainly at numbers, as well as people like Kiranjit ji, who's day in and day out interacting with the extreme manifestation of the agrarian distress in the country. Before I go to feminization of agriculture, which has been given as a topic for me, I'll take 1 minute to talk about myself and this network called ASHA, Alliance for Sustainable and Holistic Agriculture. And I would like to do so only to improve receptivity in the minds of a few people who have this strong belief that, foreign funded NGOs are coming in the way of, great agricultural development that is bound to take place if they were not there or if they were not raising their voices this way. I'm not an NGO, I'm not foreign funded, I'm not salaried, I don't hold a job. And many of my colleagues in this platform called ASHA, they're people who have actually given up lucrative careers to come back from, Switzerland, the US, a satellite communications engineer, a telecom engineer, an IT sector person, whoever it is. They've come back to do something for rural India and for farmers. If that helps in receptivity at all, I'd like you to keep your mind open about what people like us are saying. It's not because, there's some funding that's asking us to do something. I also want to say that I have a small little toe in the field too, in a drought-prone district in Anantapur, where we work with women farmers and especially seek out those women farmers from farm suicide families. Anantapur is also a district which continues to see, just in the past 3-4 months, there were at least 300 suicides. And like Kiranjit ji, I make my monthly visits there, and you can't do anything but just sit down with the woman and break down yourself, because that's something that's happening on a daily basis. And I think our views about what needs to be done very much relate to what you're getting to experience in terms of your direct relation with farmers. You could be a farmer yourself, but all others who are into policy making, I think which kind of farmer are you getting exposed to and so on matters a lot. And it's not out of place to, remind ourselves about Gandhi's talisman of trying to remember the face of the poorest and weakest person of the day that you've met, and what is it that you've been able to do or you can do for that person. And I would really love it if, I know it will become a tokenism, but if it's something that's hung in the rooms of all policymakers. Because, there's one way of looking at numbers, and several numbers seem to be fabricated out there, which will make the averages look good, if you can pull up one section. But this constant attention to that group of people who are probably pulling down your averages is probably what the focus should be, and that's where Gandhi's talisman comes in. Okay, feminization of agriculture. The economic survey also talked about feminization of agriculture this year, and the media talked about it big time. Even as it was being presented on the floor, you had all these flashing headlines talking about how Indian agriculture is getting more and more feminized. But the numbers actually don't bear it out. If there is any feminization at all, in terms of macro data, it is getting reflected essentially in operational land holdings, that a slightly higher percentage of women are operating land holdings than they used to 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But other than that, whether you look at NSSO data or census data, we actually have a picture of women getting pushed out of agriculture. And there is enough information, I would think, from some analysis that some scholars have done, which is showing that the overall workforce decline, female workforce decline in India, is actually connected to the decline of female workforce in rural India, and that is getting driven by decline in agriculture. And scholars like Vikas Raval have culled out from NSSO data to show that it's linked mainly to land disposition. And other than his earlier work that shows that there's mechanization, and I can't help but talk about herbicides as well as herbicide tolerant GM crops. Women in India find their largest source of employment to be agriculture. And when it comes to rural India, that's the mainstay for women there. And there, within agriculture, manual de-weeding is something that happens across all crops. Transplanting happens in some crops. Harvesting, of course, happens. But manual removal of weeds is a very, very important source of employment for rural women, for the poorest rural women. And if in this country we think about mission on mechanization and bring in other technologies like herbicide tolerant GM crops without worrying about how do you provide alternative employment to such women, I think it's a big problem, and I think policymakers do have to pay attention to it. But going back to the fact that census 2011 showing that for the first time everyone noted this, that there's been an absolute decline in the number of cultivators, and one also found that the number of agricultural laborers had increased. But what wasn't discussed enough is the fact that the number of women cultivators has actually declined a lot more than the number of male cultivators. In the census, as everyone knows, this is a self-declaration by the respondent. It is not based on land records. So we do have a situation where within agriculture, lesser proportion of women than it was in 2001 are actually getting employed and engaged in agriculture. And in the overall scenario also, you can see that there's more men employed in agriculture than women. But in terms of agriculture labor that goes in, it is so very clear that for every acre of land of any crop across any region of India, except for a new phenomenon that's cropping up, which is that of having to guard your crop against wild animals, where men are, sleeping in their fields night after night. It is women who put in a lot more work than men do. And there are numerous micro-studies, time-use studies, as well as other micro-studies, which are showing that 70% of labor that goes into growing any crop goes from women and not men. And unfortunately, except for one friend yesterday who in a parallel discussion brought up this radical idea that if we ever think of income transfers, it should be into a joint account and not leave the woman out. All the references to farmers over yesterday and today were about the he's of the world. Our imagination is only about male farmers. I'm so very glad that you have a picture of a woman here, because very often you find that websites of government, PowerPoint presentations of people, imagination of a farmer is always about a man. Our references are all about the male pronouns. We are not even thinking about women, and this invisibility is what needs to be addressed. So we need more feminization. We actually need more feminization in another sense than it is usually used, that term, which is that we need women to be visibilized. We need women farmers to be explicitly talked about, acknowledged, recognized, and identified. And that brings us to a big problem, which is that in this country, the establishment looks at farmers as landowners. And we've been talking about it again and again. Even yesterday, we were talking about how do we identify the real farmers. And one doesn't mean just cultivators, but farmers of a variety of farming occupations. You find that that is something that we have not cracked, even though we have a policy for farmers for the very first time in independent India, 2007. This country came up with a national policy for farmers, and it had an exciting, expansive, progressive definition of who's a farmer. And that definition actually delinked land ownership from who gets to be called a farmer. You know, a beekeeper was defined as a farmer, an agricultural laborer was defined as a farmer, a forest gatherer was defined as a farmer, a livestock rearer was defined as a farmer, a tenant farmer was defined as a farmer, and pretty often women farmers fit into all these categories. But we haven't really figured out how to actualize this definition of a farmer into the entire establishment's thinking and create our results framework, documents also around how do we cater our schemes and policies and programs, and if required, even bring new legislations to cater to this imagination of a farmer. When you take the national policy for farmers, all women farmers are farmers in their own right, whether or not they own land ownership. But because the mindset is so steeped in looking at farmers only in relation to land ownership, we've got to do a few things for sure. One is, not just for agriculture reasons, but to empower women per se. I mean, how can this country, it's a no-brainer, right? You can't start talking about SDGs, you can't talk about equitable development and so on if you can't begin thinking about how will you take women along, especially the poorest women, rural women, marginalized women. And in that context, I do think we've got to get our asset ownership parity right. And for that to happen, one way of doing it is, of course, to implement the Hindu Succession Amendment Act much more rigorously. That will address a large number of private landowners in this country. Most households are Hindu. So, you would have over a period of time at least gone to a state where maybe there's 50% land ownership between men and women. And we don't have to look at asset only as land. I mean, we can even think about tools, machines, and so on, giving that visibility to farmers. But in the absence of an immediate overnight solution, that will take time. We do need to have a system of providing identity to women farmers, and we have been proposing. I also wear multiple caps. I also represent another platform called Makam, Mahila Kisan Adhikar Manch, which was formed about 4 years ago, just to visualize the issues of women farmers. We've been asking for an identity card system to be instituted from the panchayat upwards. It's easy enough to get women to self-identify their category of farming. I could be a livestock rearer, come tenant farmer, come an agricultural laborer, and you issue identity cards. And I think coupled with that identity card, which gives you entitlement to various schemes and other services, it could be, just simple extension that reaches you also as a farmer. we could think about many other services around bankability of women farmers by instituting a credit guarantee fund that goes hand in hand with identity cards issued to women farmers. And there are only 3-4 mechanisms by which the markets will start looking at women, not just the markets, in fact, even the state agencies will begin looking at women as farmers. One is that asset ownership, that identity, and a third system could be, this is something that we just discussed in a Ministry of Agriculture workshop on October 15th, which was marked as Women Farmers Day, is about how to bring more women farmers into groups. Because all said and done, the poorest, most assetless women in this country have proven that their repayment ability and discipline is far, far higher than, I'm taking names, your Ambanis, your Adanis, your Malyas, your whoever else who's gone away from this country. They have a record to show of 94% repayment as groups without any collateral other than each other, poor women. So the need to bring these women farmers into groups, either as self-help groups or joint liability groups which are not working that well. So one of the proposals that we have is that more and more joint liability groups should actually be carved out of SHGs as smaller groups, which makes them more creditworthy and bankable. As well as, just skill certificates from several agencies which are running these courses. Maybe they're not teaching anything new. Maybe the women have a lot to teach to the course trainers and so on. I wish that would also be discussed at some point of time. But there are some mechanisms by which I think women as farmers can be made more visible as well as more credit-worthy for their farming as well as their enterprises to take off. One other aspect that we keep talking about when we talk about women farmers is the fact that there's actually a masculinization trend. There's, of course, pockets of feminization in this country, but there's a masculinization trend where women are getting marginalized from decision making related to farming. And that's for a simple reason that there's a existing asymmetry when it comes to market interface between men and women, both at the input end and the output end. And in such a context, it does look like an ecological agriculture paradigm, depending on nature's free resources, depending on commons, is something that brings in a lot more equity than depending on markets. And therefore, to talk about ecological agriculture in the context of women farmers' vision, and this is not something that I am saying or I have put in the mouths of women farmers, in meeting after meeting, we hear women farmers demanding for another farming paradigm for themselves. And that could be because there are gendered roles that are already thrust on them related to food and nutrition security for the household, various practical needs that they have. So ecological agriculture paradigm has to be promoted on a large scale. And I also want to talk about, because we're talking about food systems, and I heard no one else mention it, in our food security discourse, we've got to start looking at forests as food producing habitats. The most malnourished and undernourished communities in this country are actually forest dependent communities. And we have successfully broken the link between that forest, agriculture and food systems continuum that used to exist in their context by doing a variety of wrong things, and to be able to look at forests as those habitats that provide uncultivated, free, organic, accessible to everyone foods is a very important thing that we've got to discuss in the food security discourse in this country. I've been involved in a research project for 8 months in Raigada district in Odisha, where we used 2-3 different methodologies, some PRA methodologies to find out what are the perceptions and what's the level of importance that people give to forest foods compared to various other food sources. We measured by spring balances how much forest gathering happens to this day, and it's dependent on various factors, of course, what kind of a forest, how far is it, all those things. But we also measured the proportion of uncultivated forest food in cooked consumed foods of people, and in that study we found up to 24% of what they consume is actually forest foods across different months. And these are extremely nutritious foods. Nutritional analysis of these foods exists, rich in micronutrients and so on. I do think we've got to think about how do we conserve dense forests, diverse forests, for achieving nutrition security for the most marginalized and voiceless in this country, and not just look at the mines under those trees. I will stop there. Sorry, one last thing. I'm being hurried up by the chair, and just want to say one thing. The problem whenever you speak about women in this country, and that happens in the context of women farmers also, is the lack of gender disaggregated data. Our land records, for decades there's been a discussion, but they can't simply add one more column in the basic land records, serial number, name of the landowner, sex of the landowner. No, you don't want to make that simple change. Similarly, RBI collects data from banks about male and female account holders and all of that, but never puts it out in the public domain. I think unless we resolve this problem of gender disaggregated data being missing, we won't be able to track any progress. I'll stop there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Kavitha. We have a little bit of time for question answers. It will be standing between you and lunch, but please go ahead and ask them questions. Yes, ma'am.
This question is addressed to Kavitha. I'd just like to know, because at one point of time you were also involved in...
Just put the mic up.
Speak into the mic.
One time we were involved in collecting various kinds of data from the forest, but these are totally inaccessible. Even to get the data, I mean, you're just not allowed. So I wonder how to get the food out of those forests. I mean, like, it's totally inaccessible. It's highly protected and everything. So I really do not know how we can capture.
Well, there used to be a time in this country when the forest department was the greatest oppressor of Adivasi community members. But the access for minor forest produce is much more easier now than it used to be a few decades ago. And it's very much possible to collect it.
Any other questions? Yes,
I can speak loud, no problem.
You speak into the mic.
Recording.
When you say that farmers should get income, assured income, monthly income, the immediate question comes to raised is that what they contribute. Whether the income you ask is proportional to their contribution. So here lies the grave mistakes, erroneous, deliberate in calculating what is called as the national income. What they say is hardly 15% or 14% is the agriculture or farmers' contribution. There lies a mistake. A mistake is a deliberate one. It is the maize is the contribution, not the cornflake. It is the sugarcane is the contribution of the farmer, not the ethanol, rectified spirit, molasses. It is the barley is the contribution, not the beer, rum, the brandy. It is only the cotton is the contribution and not the cloth, garment, apparel and pants. So definitely you have the reservation on the GDP, but you blame the GDP for the right reason. So once you make, when farmers leaders except in case of the computers and the mobile, so we are making contribution in each and every goods and services we have been consuming. So once the real contribution is known in terms of the so-called, it is precisely national income, so then you will have the legitimate right to ask what is the real share in the so-called national income and the income factor. Thank you.
You're very right, Professor. I remember US study which says that the share of agriculture in the US economy is 4% on GDP is 4%. You know, in India it is still 14% or 13%, whatever you say. But there it is 4%. And yet America is putting so much of effort to protect its agriculture. Now, but what is missing there? There's a study by one of the universities there which says that the share of agriculture in the economy is 60% in America. And I'm sure your own studies, if I look at it, it shows very clearly that the share of agriculture in India's economy also maybe more than 90%. And I think this has to be accepted, and then only we can of course work out what is the contribution of farmers in the total economy. But the other part is when you say 14%, the share of normally, but we try to work it out is, oh, agriculture share is 14% of the GDP, so we don't have to worry about agriculture, is because you are not paying in agriculture, you are not paying farmers their due. So obviously, if you were to pay their dues, their contribution will also go up. You have been denying their due, denying them their rightful due, and that is why their share is coming down. If we were just like look at the seventh pay commission jacks up the GDP share also, doesn't it? So if we were to pay more to the farmers, their share would definitely go up. And more is also the problem with the investments in agriculture, which of course has been declining over the last 4 decades or 5 decades. So if they were both to simultaneously go up, the public sector investment as well as the income of the farmers, and in the way that you work it out, that the share of sugarcane, for instance, sugarcane farmers I've seen one of your studies, is what exactly has to be known.
We'll take that as the last question.
Yeah, Kavitha, just a small observation. You spoke about the role of women workforce in Indian agriculture.
You speak into the microphone.
Yeah, Kavitha ji, you spoke about the role of women workforce in Indian agriculture. I entirely admit, and you talked about the de-weeding as one of the operations. Should we also not think of reducing the drudgery in the women workforce?
We certainly need to. I think what we really need to focus on is drudgery reducing tools and machines, appropriate technology, but not employment displacing. That's the fine balance that needs to be struck.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the concluding remarks, and I hand over the proceedings to Mr. Nandakumar.